Every legendary manager has one decision. They wish history would forget. Jock Stein transformed Celtic forever. He built champions. He conquered Europe. He became one of football's greatest minds. Yet decades later, one signing still divides supporters. Many call it the biggest mistake of his extraordinary career. Others believe it was the worst signing Jock Stein ever made. But was it really? Or has history blamed the wrong man for the collapse of a football dynasty? What makes this story even stranger is that almost nobody questioned the transfer at the time. The player arrived with experience, respect, and a reputation that inspired confidence. Everything suggested success. Instead, the move became one of the most debated decisions of Jock Stein's career. Today, we're uncovering the complete story, the forgotten truth, the real people behind it, and whether this truly was Jock Stein's worst signing. Subscribe now, because football history is full of stories that deserve to be remembered, and this is one of them. To understand this story, you first have to understand Jock Stein. By 1977, he wasn't just Celtic's manager. He was one of football's greatest leaders, the man who had taken Celtic to the top of Europe. For years, his judgment had rarely been questioned. When Jock Stein believed in a player, people trusted him. But football eventually tests every legend. Celtic's great team was growing older. Then came another huge blow. Kenny Dalglish left for Liverpool. Replacing a player like Dalglish was impossible. Jock Stein needed experience, leadership, and someone he believed could steady the team. His answer was Frank Munro. Munro wasn't an unknown signing. He had captained Wolverhampton Wanderers. He had represented Scotland. He had earned respect throughout British football. But he also carried a reputation: strong-willed, fearless, never afraid to challenge authority. During his time at Wolves, he clashed with Bill McGarry. Later, his relationship with Sammy Chung also ended badly. Yet none of that changed Jock Stein's mind. He looked beyond the controversy. He saw experience, leadership, and the perfect man for the moment. What happened next would leave both men tied together forever. Frank Munro had not always been a defender. He began as a skillful midfielder. Then Bill McGarry moved him into central defence. The change transformed his career. Munro could read danger early. He was composed on the ball, and unusually elegant for such a physical player. Across his Wolves career, he made 371 appearances, won the League Cup, reached a UEFA Cup final, and earned 9 Scotland caps. Yet teammates remembered a different man, a loyal professional, a quality footballer, someone they trusted when pressure was highest. That's the player Jock Stein believed he was signing. Not a gamble, not a desperate choice, a proven winner. But football doesn't judge players by reputation. It judges them by what happens next. For Frank Munro, joining Celtic wasn't just another transfer, it was a dream. He had supported the club since childhood. Now, he finally had the chance to wear the famous green and white. The timing, however, couldn't have been worse. Celtic were no longer the unstoppable force that had conquered Europe. The squad was aging. Pressure was growing. Supporters expected instant success. There was no time to settle. No room for mistakes. Every touch, every tackle, every decision would be judged. Frank Munro had arrived believing he was helping rebuild a giant. Instead, he was walking into one of the most difficult periods in the club's modern history, and he had no idea just how quickly everything was about to unravel. October 15th, 1977. Less than 24 hours after joining Celtic on trial, Frank Munro walked into Celtic Park. What happened next stunned everyone. Jock Stein named him captain. Not after weeks, not after months. On his very first appearance, it was one of the boldest decisions of Stein's career. The opponents were St Mirren, managed by an ambitious young Alex Ferguson. Then disaster struck. Munro turned the ball into his own net. St Mirren punished Celtic. The match ended. Celtic won. St Mirren 2. For supporters, the excitement disappeared overnight. The questions came immediately. Why had a newcomer been made captain? Why had Stein placed so much faith in him? And why, despite such a disastrous beginning, did Jock Stein continue believing he was the right man? Those questions would haunt both men long after the final whistle. The criticism grew louder. Supporters questioned the signing. Many expected Jock Stein to admit defeat. He never did. Instead, he stood behind Frank Munro. That decision wasn't made by accident. Jock Stein had always believed there is no substitute for experience. To Stein, one terrible afternoon didn't erase years of proven football. He still saw the Scotland international, the Wolves captain, the defender who had earned respect across Britain. Former Wolves goalkeeper Phil Parkes later remembered Munro as a lovely fellow and a quality player. That was the footballer Stein believed still existed. Weeks after the nightmare debut, Celtic completed the transfer permanently for around £25,000. It was a decision that divided opinion immediately. Stein trusted experience. Football demanded results. Only one of them would be proved right. Jock Stein had backed his decision. Now, Frank Munro had to justify it. But football can be brutally unforgiving. The results never truly improved. Celtic struggled for consistency. The defence looked vulnerable. The pressure kept growing. Every mistake brought the signing back into the spotlight. Munro's Celtic record remained painfully brief. He made 21 starts and 1 substitute appearance. He scored no goals and won no trophies. By April 1978, Celtic had released him. Yet those who knew him best remembered a very different footballer. Former Wolves striker John Richards later described him as a close friend and one of the finest professionals he had played alongside. To Wolves, he remained a respected captain. To Celtic, he became the face of a season they wanted to forget. By the end of the campaign, Celtic finished 5th, a position almost unthinkable under Jock Stein. Only months after arriving, Munro's Celtic career was already coming to an end. The dream move had become one of the briefest and most disappointing chapters of his career. But one final question still remained. History can be unfair. One bad spell can erase an entire career. But was Frank Munro really Jock Stein's worst signing? The evidence was not that simple. His Celtic spell had clearly failed. But failure alone did not make him unique. Other Stein signings had achieved even less. Ian McWilliam made only 4 competitive appearances. Roy Kay arrived mainly as cover. John Dowie played more often, but never secured a settled role. Yet none carried the same historical weight. Munro's arrival became inseparable from the collapse surrounding Stein's final season, not because he was the weakest player, but because his arrival coincided with one of the hardest periods in Jock Stein's career. Perhaps the biggest mistake wasn't one footballer at all. Perhaps it was believing that one experienced defender could save a dynasty already beginning to crumble. That changes everything. Because it leads us to one final verdict. Not just about Frank Munro, but about Jock Stein himself. Great managers are remembered for their victories, but sometimes one failed decision survives just as long. For Jock Stein, Frank Munro became that decision. The move lasted only months, yet the debate has lasted for decades. Munro was not an unknown player, nor was he the least talented man Stein ever signed. He was a proven footballer who arrived when Celtic needed far more than one defender could provide. Stein wanted experience, authority, and stability. Instead, the transfer became larger than its brief reality. It came to represent a legendary era, finally losing its grip. Perhaps Munro was Jock Stein's worst signing, or perhaps he was simply the wrong player, signed at the worst possible moment. Either way, his name remains tied to one of the greatest managers football has ever known. Now the verdict belongs to you. Was Frank Munro truly Jock Stein's greatest transfer mistake? Or has history judged him too harshly? Share your opinion in the comments. And subscribe now, because football's greatest stories deserve more than to be forgotten.